Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Hopefully Interesting, and the first episode of us hopefully doing this on a regular basis. I am Joseph Pavlenko, joined by my partner in
Mark
crime,
Carico.
and our point here is to talk about things that interest us and hopefully are interesting to you. There's a logic and a method to the madness, folks. So, things we like, generally nerdy. We are both interested in swords and sword shaped objects, games, both video and of the board game flavor. And more on to who we are, or who I am. I'll let Mark introduce himself. Again, I am Joseph Pavlenko. I started this wacky LED lightsaber stuff about 14-ish years ago because I am an old turd. I started fighting with Shanais in an old SCA light group, moved up to glowy sticks because glowy sticks are pretty, and from there branched off into HEMA because steel is very pretty also. And basic flavor of board game, video game, nerd there as well, liking sci-fi and fantasy. So that's kind of a brief overview of who I am, what I like, and we can get more into the nitty gritty of why I do the weird things I do after Mark intros himself.
Yeah, so my name is Mark Carico. My main focus is, history and sword stuff. I started martial arts about seventh, eighth grade, so about 12-ish, and that was Korean martial arts. We touched on swords a little bit, but not particularly. After 6 or so years of that, I did. I went in the Marine Corps for 4 years, did some martial arts there. But after getting out, I found a group in Southern California that was doing LED sparring sabers and kind of fell in love with that. And opposed to how most people get into the LED saber side, I kind of went backwards. I went from lightsabers or LED sabers or whatever you want to call them into actual steel and various sorts and sizes of that. um, and so that got me in the historical route. I've always been a fan of history, but it got me more into what I would consider studying versus just looking at it. After that, or other than that, I play a lot of Warhammer 40,000. I play some video games now, especially with all the extra time on my hands. But I am a massive tinkerer in terms of what hobbies. So I make the LED sparring sabers that I use. I've been more recently tinkering with rapiers and other things, and working on some armor. So, and I'm really into the competitive side of sword fighting as well. Although, as far as steel goes, I haven't been to any official tournaments or anything, but it's something that interests me.
All right. Went on a little longer than I did.
Yeah,
Um,
just a little bit,
but
but that's how I go.
Right. And while Mark was talking, you might have noticed me doing some weird things. Again, this is our first time doing this. I'm playing around with camera angles and positioning and stuff of the like. So please don't mind if you see any of that, at least initially. We will figure out what we're doing eventually, I promise. So,
Pay no mind to the man behind the curtain.
right. So, we will figure this kind of stuff out eventually.
Yeah,
So more on to kind of what Mark was saying. Swords and sword-shaped objects. I think that's a
yo,
good place to start and a good place to kind of talk about how we got into this because that's how we met each other was
right,
with lightsaber, or as people who fear the mouse like to say, LED sparring or hitting each other with glow sticks.
right.
Excuse me.
Polycarbonate. So, for reference of what we're talking about, we both started off with what are called thin wall blades, or in a group that utilizes thin wall blades. So, for the majority of what we'll be talking about, unless we state otherwise, we're talking about a 1 inch polycarbonate tube that has a 1/8 inch wall, um, and it's generally going to be in the range of about 36 inches. Um, and it's we get sometimes I get a little bit of flack for in the steel community for using them, but it's honestly I've been hit harder by the LED sticks than I have by steel. Though I have yet to start long swords, so maybe that's a different matter. But and what's great about that community is through the various different organizations is we get a lot of people who see us and they immediately associate us with the movie. However, it also pertains we can take the historical manuals and then apply those to this otherworldly system of fighting.
Right. And that's a big part of kind of what brings everybody into this, right? Everybody kind of got into this because lightsabers are fun, um, and we're all giant, um, you know, kids to a certain point, just for the most part, trying to have fun. And going out and doing this is how we do that, socialize, for the less social people within these hobbies. And like Mark said, there's avenues for everybody. There's many styles. Some people come out and just want to boop people in the face. Some people want to get very serious, like what Mark, a couple of our other friends started doing, what I'm doing now, which is actually I have one at my desk right now, which is actually going and reading historical sources. I'm reading about British military saber from Hutton and trying to incorporate that into what I do with lightsabers, and that became my gateway drug, if you will, into HEMA and trying to buy steel swords, which that and lightsabers in video production,
Gets expensive.
oh yeah, they hurt the wallet. Um, yeah, and I mean, I think that's a risk of being a nerd, especially nowadays with so much that is in nerd culture, whether it be video games, PC gaming, um, podcasting stuff like we're trying to do here because quarantine 2020.
Hey, no, we
Uh,
can't talk about that.
no, we can't.
Um, yeah, no, exactly. And I kind of took a different route to that than most people, like yourself. I turned you on to the historical manuals. I think you had attended a couple of HEMA classes before that, but nothing major, correct?
Yeah, nothing too crazy.
Right.
It was a couple classes at South Coast Swords because a mutual friend of ours went to the class, Ewok, and he kind of got me into it. It was a lot more two-handed stuff, and I've always, back when I used to fight with Shanais, I liked the one-handed stuff. That's the style of fighting that felt more natural to me, which is why,
Boxing.
yeah, I mean, I started doing that, and then you saw how I fought and thought Saber would be a good fit, and I wound up enjoying that. Which going to South Coast Swords is fun, but they study German texts and practice German techniques, and it's a lot of two-handed
Right.
stuff, and it's not quite, I don't want to say in my wheelhouse, but it's not stuff I see myself using in the lightsaber game we play,
Right.
and it's good to know, but there are other things that interest me more on the sword
Yeah.
sport aspect that I would rather spend my time pursuing and learning, whether it's talking to someone like Mark or other like-minded people online or reading texts from people who wrote about it that actually did it in the period and doing it well meant getting home at the end of the day. So,
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I mean, that's a big HEMA organizations, right? And for those of us who, or for those of you who don't, it's a historical European martial arts. Um, and the idea is you take, in the same way that you might have kenjutsu coming out of Japan, or the various forms of karate coming out of Okinawa or kung fu from China. In that same way that you're supposedly studying manuals or techniques or what have you from antiquity, essentially, or the medieval period or different periods throughout those cultures' history. HEMA is kind of the same effect, but we study primarily original source material. So, like, I'll pick on Peoria as an example, or Hutton actually, because you held up the Hutton's Cold Steel, which is one of my favorite manuals for Victorian era military paper. And so you're getting a first-hand account of how that author wanted his students to fight. Um, and the manuals reach all the way back into the, I believe, 12th century with I-33 or O-33, depending on how you want to refer to it. Um, and the thing I like about HEMA versus other martial arts is I feel like with a lot of martial arts, it's more of a game of telephone, where one master, through oral tradition, might hand it down to another master, and then that master adds or subtracts what he wants, passes it down to another master, and so down the line up until the modern period. Um, Whereas with the HEMA organizations, really we're at this maybe 20, about 30 years or so for the serious people who are studying it. Um, and so we're first generation, really, and those people are reading the original source material, they're interpreting it how they want, and passing it on down the line. And as Joe hit on, going to HEMA classes, whether for good or bad, you're going to have a school focuses on a source. Generally, it's in the name, like the very broad sort of academy. But a school focuses on a style of fighting. Generally, within HEMA, the most popular weapon is going to be longsword, because we all want to play Lord of the Rings. We all want to play Knight in Shining Armor.
And I think more recently it's people trying to play still Lord of the Rings, but I think Game of Thrones kind of reinvigorated that scene.
The Witcher.
Yeah, and stuff like that. Prior to
Yep.
Longsword, I think you and I have kind of talked about it, almost like Proto-HEMA, right? Which would be SCA, which it was armored heavy combat, again, going back to that idea of knightly
Or
combat
their rapier and cut and thrust.
and
Don't forget about
rapier, because a lot of people think about the, I want to say Renaissance, but most people probably think like the Man in the Iron Mask or the Three Musketeers, and maybe not aware of the time period, but they know, ooh, rapier, and that's cool. And so
that.
that's kind of where the SCA niche is. And
Yeah.
due to that, I think the second most prevalent weapon in HEMA is rapier.
Yep. Yeah, and from what I understand, saber is coming up behind it in various sorts and sizes. Really, you have two main divisions within saber, and that's Polish saber and English saber. Um, Italian saber does fit in there as well, but from what I understand, it's less studied.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, so I took kind of a different approach or a different avenue of approach for getting into like the steel side, the HEMA side, the studying the manuals and all of that than Joe did, because I turned Joe onto it. But I taking on an instructor role essentially within one of the Southern California organizations for LED sparring sabers, and I was getting questions that I didn't know how to answer, or getting asked for advice on techniques that I didn't understand. So I hopped on YouTube, hopped on Google, and just started digging through piles of information to sort through different styles and different systems of fighting, and and that's kind of how I got my start. is I was trying to learn so I could better aid other other fighters. Um, and now, like yourself, I'm more interested in HEMA. Um, I got a rapier, a second rapier coming in that Joe ordered
Yep.
with some of his own stuff. Um, I got some wall hanger sabers that I practice with. Eventually, I'm gonna get one of those for sparring, and looks like I'll be getting a fetter now, even though I hate fetters.
Any particular reason why you dislike a fetter?
Well, I feel like they're an accurate training weapon, but they're in the same realm as using a single stick for saber. A use they're in that same category, or using an FA for training for small swords. So a fetter is essentially an FA in premise. It's lighter, it's more flexible, it's not always lighter, but more flexible. It's a little more competitive, a little safer to spar with theoretically. Um, and so, but in our modern version of HEMA equipment that we're going through, there's really, in my mind, no reason why we shouldn't be using something like a technique fetter that actually has the same blade profile as actual sharp or close to it. In my mind, there's no reason why we shouldn't be doing that. But fetters are what most competitions are done with. For those of you, again, who don't know what a fetter is or what we're talking about, obviously you can Google it. I believe the full name is fetish first, although I'm obviously butchering the enunciation because I'm not German.
Right.
Um,
I'm gonna set it to your cam real quick while we're recording this,
okay.
and if you keep talking, I'll
Yeah.
find a picture of a fetter that we can drop
Yep.
in our video, and we
Um,
can show that.
yeah. And if you could also pull up a picture of a longsword for people who aren't familiar with non-movie longswords.
Yeah,
But
definitely.
my main problem with it is it's not the weapon we're actually training for. Now they use fetters back in the day in Germany. As far as I know, there are no other accounts of people using fetters to train with in any other country. Although that's not to say it didn't happen. We in fact have very few surviving um, fetters from that period because, like any other training weapon, use it till it breaks and then you throw it out or you melt it down or whatever like that. Um, but yeah, just in my mind, so there's this thing called artifact within any kind of training you do. Um, so an artifact of Olympic foil fencing is the whippiness of the blade, right? Or another and being able to count on the flex of the blade in order to get a hit, or it's something like um, their timing, which is a fraction of a second. Um, Basically, it's the speed of electricity through the wires, is how it was explained to me. Um, and so you just have to get the first hit. So using defensive actions aren't as prevalent. So that would be an artifact. And everything you do that removes you from the source material, from the original object, introduces more artifacts. And what that means is because we're choosing as a community to stay away from that, away from the proper simulators, the things that are closer to real sharp longswords, or single sticks. Up until recently, we didn't have appropriate trainers for sabers, for Victorian era military sabers. Um, but in my mind, you should be using as close of a weapon as you can, or training weapon as you can, in order to better simulate the thing you're doing. Right. I come from, a military background, so shooting, somewhat competitive shooting, is kind of ingrained into me. And the way I view fetters is kind of the same way you would if you were going through your drills with a rubber gun. Right. So you have your pistol going into the holster. You're going through all these simulations, but you're going to get artifacts due to the weight. You're going to get artifacts due to not being able to properly manipulate the functionality of the weapon. And so if you ask any credible source for training for firearms, the thing they harp on is, well, how many rounds do you put down range? How often are you doing it? How often are you using the real thing? So if you supplement something like a fetter, or a single stick, even if you supplement that with an appropriate amount of time spent with the actual weapon, then there's nothing really wrong with that. But not a lot of schools are doing that. Now there are some, like there's one up in Sacramento, that they do most of their work, or at least the beginning level of their work, with technique fetters from Purple Heart, and those are roughly correct to what a generic longsword should be. If anyone wants to read more about longswords, look at the Oakshott typology and you'll see 20, 30, 40 different versions. But yeah, that's I can talk about fetters all day and why I don't like them, but that's a brief rundown.
Right. And ooh, I probably shouldn't have overlaid that right over your camera. But
Oh,
there's a fetter, or we can't really see the full thing, a fetter schwit. I probably butchered that pronunciation. And then
yeah.
we have the
It essentially means lightweight or
right.
featherweight,
And then we have
from what
our
I know.
longsword right there. So,
Right. So you can see different things like the shield in front of the guard. The guard's obviously going to look a bit different. Blade's going to be more flexible and thinner. There's just a lot of differences between that and the original weapon. In my mind, it's almost analytical, like almost an analog for if you wanted to take a rapier blade and stick a longer hilt on. That's essentially what it is. Now it's a lot stiffer and a lot heavier than a rapier blade, and I'm probably making some people angry if anyone watches this. But this is my view on it, and why I think it's not a great training tool. It was when we had no better option. I'll say that.
well, and you while I was searching real quick, and anybody watching this, if you think the weird lower thirds and the aids were popping up are a little much, let us know in the comments. Our goal is to improve the show, and the production of the show, and hopefully we will get better at producing the show as we go on. That's the idea, hopefully.
Right.
But we were playing For Honor a couple nights ago, and you equated a fetter to an épée, or a foil
Yeah.
for modern Olympic fencing. It was meant to be, I know I caught on to you saying it was a more sport-oriented weapon in the time. And it was also meant
Yeah.
to be lighter, because while they had gambesons, they didn't have the technology to make the high-dense foam that is in some HEMA jackets or reinforced with plastic like we do now. So making
Right.
a lighter sword with proper control or proper application of control using the techniques, and control is very subjective,
Right.
but that was their way of being able to practice without A, using sharps, or B, just blunting a sharp and, you know,
Hoping for the best.
yeah, and maiming,
Still
knocking
breaking
out.
them.
Yeah. So,
Yeah, and you got to think of the time period as well. There were no fencing masks. I'm sure you could, wear a helmet they obviously had steel helmets at that time. But in the original source material, Meyer, for example, they show pictures of people sparring or what we think is sparring. They could be drilling, they could be sparring, they could be just looking at each other while the person draws pictures. Um, but yeah, if you look at the original source material, they're wearing a doublet or an akaton or something like that. Um, um,
Right,
Puffy
like
pants. They're
looking at
wearing nothing on their shins. They're wearing, you know, that kind of civilian attire. You might wear a thicker gambeson or akathon or doublet or whatever you want to call it, which I mean, to their credit, could be 30 or so layers of wool tightly stitched together in a quilt stitch, and they could be very protective equipment, but it's not on the level of what we have now.
right, and I'm flipping through yet another HEMA book I have because I swear I flipped through it and there was pictures that basically depict what Mark was talking about from that
Mm-hmm.
period
Yeah.
because visual aids are awesome. So
Visual aids are.
stuff like this, right? So we had stuff like this right here, where they're basically, and like what Mark was saying, a gambus and a doublet, showing
Right.
techniques. Granted, this heading is war, and this is coming out of Richard Marsden's book, which is Historical European Martial Arts in its Context. And I should
Right.
probably say where that image was
This
from where he
context is
sourced
awesome.
it. Right. And attributing sources is also kind and awesome because
Oh yeah.
I didn't invent
Um,
this or write this or collect this information. Somebody
right.
with far more
And on that
time.
as well, we are going off of our best information. We're obviously trying to present correct information where we can. Um, and I'm not one for guessing too much when I'm trying to tell someone else about a thing. So what this is going to be more is going to be kind of a brief overview. Maybe not so brief if Joe lets me ramble on a little too much, but it's going to be a brief overview that hopefully gets you interested and promotes further research on different subjects. Um, so if we're talking about, I might hit on doublet, roll, just quick and simple and next, which is not something I tend to do, but maybe, and hopefully you go look further into it. But on that note, also, if we get something wrong, just let us know in the comments. We'll make corrections if necessary. We might go also and talk about maybe you think, maybe the audience thinks that something we say is wrong, but it's not wrong in the context that we meant. We just didn't make it clear enough. If that makes sense.
Right. And much like, excuse me, much like a TV personality I enjoy, Alton Brown, or much like Matt Easton on his Scholar Gladiatoria channel, there could be times when Mark and I maybe hit on something. It isn't the goal of the video to produce something talking about, let's say, for sake of example, he keeps mentioning doublets. So we're not deep diving doublets. Maybe it's interesting. Maybe you look at it. Maybe we cover it in another video because you asked a question or left a comment, or it's just something we realized we had a lot more. And I'm using the royal we because it's probably something Mark has a lot more knowledge on, and I'm going to be having to do some form of research because, like Mark said, I'm going to try and get as much right as possible. For me, at least, this is a hobby outside of my day job. And I would even say it's a hobby of Mark's, but one that
Yeah.
he invests much more time into than I currently am either able to or, yeah, able to mostly for time constraints and having a
Right.
million other hobbies. So,
Yeah. No, definitely. I do spend quite a bit of time. I would honestly say more than most people on reading. and searching out historical accounts and reading stuff about history, about equipment, about whatever the case might be. My business partner actually made fun of me the other day on the phone because he said there's nothing that I get into that I don't research. And that's honestly true. When I start listening to a new band, if I really like the music they're doing, I'll sit down, I'll read their Wikipedia page, I'll read some articles about them, I'll try and find more information about them so I can put all their music into context, maybe so I can understand them as a person and the thing that they're trying to create a little bit better. That I would say I have a lot of hobbies. I would say my number one hobby is just researching things. Um, but like I said earlier, this isn't a doctrinal thesis. Don't expect it to be that level. But um, if we get something wrong, we get something wrong. We're human, and we're on YouTube. Go take a lecture if you want something 1,000% accurate, correct?
Right, and there's a bunch of those, especially within HEMA and sword fighting, that you can go to. Biggest event
Mm-hmm.
down here, to give a shameless plug, would be SoCal Sword Fight, and they do lots of talks. When they
Right.
run their event, SoCal Sword Fight, they like having events, they like having experts. If they could, they would get all the experts, I am sure.
Mm-hmm.
And I've heard they want to expand that event so more people can come. They can get more experts, I'm sure, and they can run bigger, better tournaments with more ability to have more people in tournaments, more people playing, having fun with swords, and more open sparring and stuff like that. Another big West Coast one, I would say, which is the mecca of just fighting in general, would be Combat Con.
Yep.
And that's up in Vegas every year. TBD this year, potentially. We don't know.
Right.
Things are fluid as global situations happen. And then on your side of the world, Mark, I know you've got the Black Tiger School, which I know you've mentioned, but I don't know what they're about or what kind of events they host.
Right. As far as my information or my knowledge, they don't host events. The idea is a rapier school. That's Robert Child's school. And yeah, it's more of a community type school rather than a set in stone building. I'm sure he would like to set one up, but um, he yeah, it's more of a community just trying to make everybody better
Okay.
at rapier fighting specifically.
Okay. Um,
But
and
we have the Diamond Rose Academy, which was supposed to host a tournament recently, but due to current situations, didn't. We have the Sacramento Sword School. We have the Sacramento. Um, Again, I'm going to butcher the enunciation. I think they're Fetters Church School or Fet something. But it's a German longsword school essentially. And then all over the place, they have various SBA groups or the Society for Creative Anarchism, I believe it is.
Anachronisms, maybe.
Anachronism, that's the one.
And yeah,
That's funny.
they're rapier based. I know down on my side of the world in SoCal, we've got at least two groups or two baronies. We've got the one in
Right.
Orange County, the one that services the Inland Empire. For HEMA schools up by you, you mentioned it earlier in the video. Davin is up there,
Yep.
which is one of
You got
our.
the yeah. And you got the Davenport School. I believe it's Stephen Fick who runs that. And we have the SETI Institute, which is not a dedicated HEMA school, but they do a lot of HEMA stuff there, as well as on guard fencing. Um, there's actually quite a few schools. They're just like all of Northern California. They're spread out by hundreds of miles, unfortunately.
Right. And up in Davin Ridge, while we're talking about that, we can mention another member of TSL, also known as the Saber Legion, is a member of that school, attends that school. Your tag
Are
team
they
partner.
Sluggers? Yeah.
Yeah. And we've talked about HEMA and stuff a lot. We haven't really hit like LED sparring or TSL or anything. What would your, if you had to give it a percentage, I'd say probably like 20, 25%. What do you think, in your mind, the percentage of people doing TSL that want to read historical sources and apply those techniques are? Or do you think most people just do it for the sense of community, the sense of camaraderie, and just going out and having an excuse to hang out and socialize? As an adult especially, I think, because we get busy and tied up in our adult lives, especially when some people, when you have kids and they enter the equation, you almost need that excuse to go out, whether you're an introvert and you just don't like to go out, or you're an adult burdened by, burdened is maybe a wrong word, but an adult overwhelmed by the adult responsibilities that you may or may not have.
Um,
That was a tangent.
yeah,
Apologize.
no worries. I would say honestly that's a majority of people within. I would not even picking on one organization, but I think the LED sparring community. Um, I would say I would say that of the community, you probably have, unfortunately, you probably have somewhere in the range of 60% of people who don't even show up. You know, they want to talk about it online, they want to watch the videos, but either they don't want to show up because for whatever reason, or they can't show up because, like I said, life gets in the way. I would say between 50 and 60% of people are in that category.
Okay.
That number can be a lot higher if you look at Facebook groups and things like that. 5,000 people might be on a Facebook group, but only like 1,000 comments or
Right.
posts.
Right.
And that's an unfortunate part of it, of trying to get accurate data on certain things, because they might, light, or glow stick fighting, LED sparring, whatever you want to call it. They think it's such a cool idea. They check it out. They spend one day in that group, and then that's it. But
Right.
they never leave the group page. So I
Right.
would say in the range of 50% to 60% are in that range of it's a passing interest, or it's an interest that they cannot participate in. I would say, and then on top of that, I would say that it would be 30 to 40% um, that are in the category of they just want to go out there and imitate the movie, whatever movie they are trying to imitate. Um, they're going out there, they're trying to role play as their favorite character, and not in the sense of like LARP, where you're actually getting into a character and it's like Dungeons and Dragons but real life.
Which isn't a
Um,
bad thing. If that's
it's
what gets
nothing
you
wrong with
out
that.
and that's what gets
Yeah,
you active, that's great.
yeah. I will never shame anyone who gets off the couch and does something.
Right.
Legal and safe. Let me caveat
Yeah.
that. But and non-morally questionable. Go further into that. But yeah. So, but when I mean role play, it means that they are internally fantasizing that they are living out this grandiose, like Duel of Fates and all of that. And there's nothing wrong with that. Again, you're getting up, you're moving, you're hitting people, you're doing things. But unfortunately, I would say between 10 and 20% have any interest in using somewhat of good technique, using some kind of technical background. And that doesn't mean you're a good fighter, and that doesn't mean you're a bad fighter. It's a lot of it has to do with your own physical ability and things like that.
Resources,
But the
how easy it
question,
is to find that. I said resources also, like how easy it is for
right,
you to find that, how easy it is for you to apply that. Like you said, physicality. You might not
right,
just body type. You might not be able to get into a proper sword technique stance. And let's
right,
be honest, 90 to 100% of them aren't comfortable.
Right. I would say closer to 100%, and that's the thing I tell people when training them is they'll tell me, "Oh, this isn't comfortable." And it's like it's sword fighting. It's not meant to be comfortable. Now, if you're overturning a joint or if you're breaking yourself trying to get into a stance, then it's wrong. Um, and that's my most common phrase when I'm teaching people is if it doesn't conform to a basic understanding of physics and human anatomy, it doesn't matter if it's 100 years old or 1,000 years old. It's wrong. You know, maybe not in the context it was originally applied. Like it might not be optimized, but there are definitely techniques out there, generally in the Asian martial arts, because it's like I said earlier, it's kind of that game of telephone,
Yeah.
where they don't always conform to to physics or human anatomy, and they're definitely not as efficient because you're not getting them from a original source material. Now, sports like kendo or taekwondo, those are definitely more efficient than the average because uh, they're looking a lot at the tournaments and the competition. But so yeah, I would say about 10 to 20% might be in that range of I want to do actual technique. Of the fighters that are like, I want to study the original source manuals and I want to read as much as possible. I want to learn the proper techniques and I want to learn them from the original source. And then I want to be able to apply that within, glow stick fighting. I would say you're talking at most like 5% at most. It'd probably be closer to like 1%. And again, that doesn't make you better.
No.
Um,
I would say our prior champion, or the prior champion in TSL. I say our
yep,
because I'm part of that
first
organization. Yeah, and Marcus as well. But Jimmy, I'm going to butcher his last name, Jimmy
Sorrel.
Sorrell.
Yep.
Minimal, like sword martial arts experience. Has some, but it's not his primary background. Didn't stop him from winning the championship. And then the gentleman that overcame him and won the belt, Jason Newing. Again, hopefully I'm pronouncing the names correctly. I'm not sure his experience. I know he seems to like sword sport, but I don't know where he's trained or how classically trained he might be.
So from what I understand, and if he watches this, he might send me a message that I'm wrong. But from what I understand, he does have some kind of HEMA background, but most of his background is in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Um, and he actually is, from what I understand, a professional cornerman for MMA stuff.
I
Um,
am now more thankful than ever we don't allow grappling in TSL.
right. Um, yeah. But it's definitely an interesting um, difference because the person, if we go back down the line, and I'm not going to mention names because they might not like being talked about as the former champion, right? So the current champion, he has martial art experience, some HEMA experience, um, but not a whole lot of HEMA experience. He's more of an LED guy. The prior guy to that, he only had second-hand knowledge from people that studied, and not a whole lot of it. Although he was very dedicated, but um, he pretty much had no proper sword fighting experience, right? Um, Prior to him is a guy that like lives and breathes his martial art. And again, I'm not going to pick out names or anything, but lives and breathes martial art, his martial art, and and kind of is it's kind of treats it as a lot of people treat religion. He's really far down that road. The prior one to him had years of German longsword and other martial arts, and the prior one to him, at least to start off, didn't have any real background. But if you look at the top 15 within TSL, um, um, most of us have some kind of martial background, some kind of sword fighting background, or are currently reading it to try and make ourselves better.
That's fair.
And the interesting thing about that too, within TSL, there's a lot of people that talk about one-handed versus two-handed. Most of the top 15 are actually two-handed fighters.
Right. I think a lot of any sport becomes there's some kind of metagame, whether people believe it exists or people see something cool and go, "Oh, this is the thing that's hot. I need to learn this because everybody doing good is doing this." And there's that
Right.
impression of just because someone does well with a style, whether it be one-handed, two-handed, this style versus that style, somebody does well, and there's going to be people that want to imitate it. It's kind of
Right.
how the UFC went from any kind of fighting come in, and we've got people fighting karate, savate, kickboxing, kung fu, all of this, to the meta of the UFC, I would say right now is basically a stand-up game, which is mostly kickboxing. You've got a
Yeah.
couple leg strikes, mostly like power punches to try to knock somebody out quick. Because any
Yeah,
fight, the
especially in the
less
heavyweight.
yeah, and any fight, the less damage you take fighting, the better for you. And
Right.
then there's some kind of wrestling, and the majority of the people that do the ground game or the wrestling, it's Brazilian jiu-jitsu.
Right.
So that's with any kind of competitive sport, I would say. And kind of talking about back to that martial art conversation we were having, or that you were mentioning about some people with martial arts. I think most martial artists, being a career martial artist, you're a fan of that style, and most
Yeah.
fans are, fan is short for fanatical, which is why I think most people get that way about their martial art because, to a degree, to want to practice it that long, you have to believe what you're doing is the best. Or why have you been studying, like a gentleman we know, why have you been studying Okinawan karate for 20 years if you don't think it's the best martial art in the world?
Right.
You have to think
And
there's some kind of merit to it.
right. And on that, I mean, there is um, there is something to be said for tradition. Maybe it's something that your family passed down, or maybe you went to a karate school as a kid because Ninja Turtles or Karate Kid or something like that, and you did it with one of your parents or an older sibling or something like that, and you stuck with it in the same way that people stick with sport teams because their family was into it, or they have good memories of other people within it, um, or maybe on other terms of merit, maybe you feel like it gives you discipline or better mental focus, or makes you calmer because you're meditating and you have an outlet for your aggression, if you want to call it that. Um, so within the realm of what most people refer to as martial arts, there is more than just competing. But what I think, Joe, you were hitting on a little bit more is people who study a form and then want to fight competitively, or a system and want to fight competitively, and it doesn't work for them, but they're insistent that it does, and they're not willing to either break with that tradition or figure out ways to tweak it to make it more effective.
A little bit. I just think there's a level people get to where you have to believe what you're studying is the best, right? For
Right.
better or worse. Like you said, whether you refuse to tweak the technique or whether you're willing to tweak the technique. And just, I think in general, to study a more traditional and older martial art, not something we'd consider modern, which would be like UFC. I'd call modern combat stuff, right? Because it's a lot more flexible, and the goal is knock the guy out or get him on the ground and break a joint so he can't fight anymore, which is very akin to going back to us talking about HEMA. It's very much a lot of masters talk about hit the forward targets, disable the hand,
Right.
disable the arm, because if they can't pick up a sword, then you can walk away
Yeah.
and they can't attack you, or then they're on the ground and they can't attack you, and you can decide what you want to do with them, whether it's capture them, end them rightly, or what have you. Right.
Yeah.
Capture that. Yeah. I think I said capture them several times.
Yeah, you could capture them and sell them back to the opposing army or something. Right?
All right. So you might be able to tell things look a little different. We had some audio issues back in the past. We're now in the present. We started recording in the daytime. Probably noticed by the end of that video, because Mark and I like to talk, my living room got darker as the sun went down because time moves and sun's set. And we are now in my lovely artificially lit living room, continuing the topic and kind of ending the video. We were interrupted by a headset dying as we were talking about techniques and attacking advancing targets and why that's good and why masters advocated that. Mostly that was so you could make it home at the end of the day and disable your opponent.
And it's not just the old masters either that talk about that. You go over that kind of idea in Eskrima and other more modern martial arts. Death by 1,000 cuts. Because if I can hit you and you can't hit me, then that's the ideal situation. It's if I'm outside of your measure, but you're still inside of my measure, which measure is a topic for a whole video on its own. But then that allows me to hit whatever I want, and then you can't hit me. So if I can just sit there and nick the back of your hand, which would do substantial damage, especially in unarmored or heavy clothing fighting, then I can just hit you in the back of the hand until you can't hold your sword anymore, or whatever the case is. And then I can, stab you in the throat if I want. I can stab you in the chest, in the head. I can do those finishing moves. So, and the problem with most competitions is there's no way to simulate that. If I hit you in the back of the hand and you're wearing thickly padded gloves, then nothing's going to happen. Hopefully. But it is a valid reason why you would end a fight right there,
Yeah. And like you were talking about measures, probably an entirely separate video we can do something on. We can also probably sneak in the idea of a tempo in there, because that's kind of adjacent to being relevant, as well as the ideas behind true time. Or I'm sure, because we like to talk, each of those could be their own video, because we also don't stay on topic, but we like to talk about a lot of interesting things, mostly about swords, sword combat, or things that interest us.
Right.
I know you could easily go an hour if I asked you anything about 40K.
Oh yeah, easy.
You could solo that super easy.
Yeah. And on the note of like measure, tempo, all the different ways of talking about it, really they're all talking about the same thing. So I think that could be its own video, or just one video, unless we get feedback, questions and things like that, because it's very much that your measure affects your tempo. Tempo in this case meaning time. There's lots of different ways, different things tempo can mean in a fight. But the further away you are, the longer it takes to hit someone. I relate that to like George Silver's time of hand, time of foot, time of, whatever. It's all different ways of talking about the same thing. So that could be just one video. But like you said, we like to get, I especially like to get off topic and ramble and
talk about different things. So
Yeah. And so, like we said earlier, hopefully you think all this is interesting. Hopefully, at least something we mentioned, whether it is LED or lightsaber combat or HEMA or us just talking about historical stuff, or if we branch off into weird gaming stuff, whether it be video games or games like 40K or anything like that. Hopefully you stick around. Let us get a grip on producing the show. We plan to continually improve the presentation of this, and yeah, if there's anything you want to know about, let us know in the comments.
yep. And even if it's something that we don't know a lot about, just leave it in the comments and I'll research it to the best of my ability. Like I said, take this as like encyclopedia type overview of a subject, but we'll work at getting you our best information possible.
All right. So I think we're going to call that, we will call this beta test, episode 1, episode 0, the dumpster fire episode.
Pilot
Pilot.
episode. Hopefully it was something interesting. Hopefully it was interesting.
All right. So I think we're going to wrap it in. Bye, folks.
Bye.